The horse moved slow beneath him, its ribs faintly visible beneath a sunburnt hide, hooves raising little ghosts of dust with each step. Elias Mercer rode with the air of a man long emptied, shoulders bowed, eyes fixed on the distant smudge of a settlement that clung to the desert horizon. The sky was bruised with evening, streaks of violet and ember stretching across the west, and the wind carried the faint smell of rain that would not come. His coat was worn thin, edges frayed from years of use, and a rifle strapped across his saddle bore the scars of old battles, nicks on the barrel, scratches on the stock. He carried it not with pride, but with the tired inevitability of a man who had lived too long with steel for company. Beneath his coat, his heart bore deeper wounds. The war, the fever that had taken his wife, the long silence from the son who had chosen another life far to the east. Elias was a man who had buried too much and carried what remained in silence. The settlement appeared as little more than a cluster of low adobe and timber buildings pressed hard against the desert floor. Smoke drifted in thin gray lines from a few chimneys. Chickens scattered at his approach, and two boys paused in their game to stare. The place looked neither welcoming nor hostile, only weathered, as though it had endured the years with a stubborn will. He pulled his horse to a stop before the trading post. Its walls were rough plaster, its door worn smooth by countless hands. Elias dismounted stiffly, boots striking the dust, and tethered his horse to a rail that leaned tiredly against the building. For a long moment he simply stood, hat in hand, as though gathering the will to enter. He was a stranger again, and strangers seldom found warmth in such places. Inside, the air was cooler, scented faintly with cedar smoke and dried herbs. Shelves lined with beans, flour, and tools filled the dim space. Behind the counter stood a woman whose black hair was braided long, streaked now with silver. Her eyes were sharp, and though her face was lined by time, there was a quiet strength in her bearing. Elias knew her at once, though years had passed. "Nahava," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She regarded him without surprise, as if she had expected him to walk through her door eventually. "Elias Mercer." Her voice carried the weight of memory. Years before, in a snowbound valley, he had found her wounded and alone after a skirmish gone badly. He had carried her to safety, bound her wounds, and left her with food enough to last until her kin returned. They had parted without promises, and he had never thought to see her again. Yet here she stood, as though the desert itself had woven them back together. "You still walk this world," she said softly. "I do," Elias answered, "for better or worse." Her gaze lingered on him, measuring not his words but the wear in his face, the scars that time had carved. Then, without preamble, she spoke. "You seek a wife? My daughter would be perfect for you." The word struck him like a gust of cold wind. Elias blinked, uncertain if he had heard right. A shadow moved in the far corner of the room, and his eyes turned toward it. There, half hidden in the dim light, stood a woman younger than himself but with the same stillness in her bearing. Her hair was braided down her back, dark as raven feathers. Her eyes, sharp, steady, unreadable, met his only for an instant before turning away. The daughter. Elias felt the stir of unease in his chest. Nahava's words were simple, but beneath them lay a dozen meanings. Was it mockery? A test? A warning dressed as jest? He could not say. He felt the weight of the land pressing on him, the ancient mistrust between those who had come from the east and those who had always belonged to the soil. His presence here was no small thing, and her words carried the force of that knowledge. He cleared his throat, shifting his hat in his hands. "I did not come here seeking such." "Perhaps not," Nahava said, her expression unreadable. "But sometimes the desert gives what we do not ask for." The younger woman, Ahyoka, moved past him without a word, carrying a bundle of cloth toward the doorway. The brush of air as she passed seemed to carry her silence with it, a silence sharper than speech. Elias stood rooted, feeling both unwelcome and strangely chosen, as though some thread had been drawn tight between them. "Does your town still take in travelers?" Elias asked, forcing steadiness into his voice. Nahava inclined her head. "There is a room at the back. You will find no luxury, only shelter." Shelter was all he needed. He paid in coins tarnished with age, and she accepted without counting, her eyes never leaving his. As she turned to fetch the key, Elias felt the gaze of unseen eyes upon him. neighbors who would hear of his arrival by sundown, whispers that would grow like brush fire in dry grass. When he stepped back outside, the evening air had cooled. Lamps flickered to life in windows, firelight casting shapes across the dust. Elias led his horse to the small lean-to behind the post, rubbing its tired neck before laying out feed. As he worked, his mind replayed Nahava's words again and again. "You seek a wife? My daughter will be perfect for you." He could not fathom her meaning, yet the image of the daughter's braided hair and unreadable eyes stayed with him, refusing to fade. In a life marked by silence, he had not expected to be seen at all, yet in this desert town he had been named, measured, and perhaps chosen, whether he willed it or not. That night, in the narrow bed of the back room, Elias lay awake listening to wind press against the adobe walls. Loneliness weighed heavy, but mingled with it now was something else, faint and unfamiliar, a ghost of possibilities stirring in the dust. The nights in the desert were colder than Elias remembered. The day's heat, merciless and dry, fled as soon as the sun dropped behind the ridges, leaving the settlement wrapped in a thin cloak of chill. He sat by a low fire behind the trading post, a tin cup of bitter coffee in his hand, staring into the flames as though they might reveal something he had long forgotten. The fire hissed and cracked, a voice older than any man. Elias leaned forward, letting the warmth reach his scarred knuckles. Shadows flickered across his face, deepening the lines carved there by grief and silence. The memories came, as they always did when the firelight grew low. He saw again the fever that had stolen Clara from him, the way her hand had gone still in his, leaving their small cabin hollow. He saw his boy, James, standing stiff and angry at the graveside, refusing to meet his father's eye. The boy had grown into a man elsewhere, choosing a life of iron rails and city smoke, leaving Elias to the dust. And beneath it all, like a drumbeat beneath his ribs, he felt the fields of war, the endless gray ranks, the thunder of cannons, the soil soaked in the weight of young men whose names no one remembered. He drank the coffee, though it tasted like ashes. To live was to carry it, loss upon loss, silence upon silence. Some men found peace with it. Elias never had. A sound drew his gaze. Near the stables, by the half-faded light of the moon, a Ahyoka moved among the horses. She worked quietly, her shawl brushing against the animal's flanks, her braid falling forward as she checked a hoof. She never spoke to them, yet they stilled under her hands, as though her silence carried more comfort than words. Elias watched her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing against the dark. She carried herself like someone who had lost much and learned to keep standing anyway. The settlement whispered, as settlements always did. He had caught fragments already, her husband slain in a raid along the borderlands, her young years marked by blood and the bitter taste of abandonment. Widowhood clung to her like a garment she could neither take off nor repair. In her, Elias recognized something of himself, the hollow spaces left behind when those once loved had gone. He set the cup down and stood, walking back inside the post. The room was dim, lit by a single lantern that threw long shadows across the walls. There, in the corner, stood a loom, its frame worn, threads broken and half forgotten. Dust had gathered along its beams, as though it had not been used in many seasons. Elias paused, his hand brushing lightly over the wood. It reminded him of the tools he himself had carried through years of silence, his rifle above all. That rifle leaned now against the wall near his bedroll, its stock polished only by necessity, barrel marked with the weight of too many skirmishes. A weapon, yes, but more than that, a relic of survival, as much a part of him as the scars on his body. He wondered if the loom was the same for her, a reminder of what had been lost, or what might never return. And there, beyond the loom, tucked carefully inside a cedar chest, he glimpsed something pale as moonlight. A corner of cloth lay exposed, a dress, white and untouched. It was no garment for daily labor. Its careful stitching, its unworn folds, spoke of a future interrupted. A wedding dress, hidden away like a memory too painful to discard. Elias turned his eyes aside, as though by not looking too closely he might grant her dignity. Nahava sat nearby, her chair angled toward the fire, her long braids streaked with silver. She watched him without speaking, as though she had been studying him since the moment he entered her threshold. There was no hostility in her gaze, only the deep patience of someone who had endured far longer than most men ever could. She seemed to carry in her silence a knowledge neither he nor her daughter would dare put into words. "You've seen loss," she said at last, her voice low, as though speaking to the coals rather than to him. "I have," Elias answered. "So has she." The words hung between them, heavy but not cruel. Elias gave no reply. There was nothing to be said that would not feel like trespass. Later, lying on his cot, he listened to the faint creak of boards above, the rustle of wind through the cracks, the murmur of horses settling in the dark. His thoughts returned again and again to Ahyoka's steady movements, the dust on her loom, the untouched white dress. Symbols, perhaps, of the way grief left its mark, not always in tears, but in what was set aside and never touched again. He thought of his own rifle, still loaded though he prayed never to fire it again. He thought of the empty rocking chair that had stood beside his half a years after Clara's passing, unmoved, as though waiting for her return. Tools, objects, remnants, each a vessel of memory. In the silence of that desert night, Elias felt a strange recognition. Ahyoka's loss was not the same as his, yet it rhymed with his own. Where others might see only division, Apache and settler, young widow and scarred veteran, he saw instead the echo of a wound that belonged to both. The realization came slowly, like embers glowing beneath ash. Past grief is a wound that either festers in silence or binds two souls who recognize the same scar in one another. For the first time in many years, Elias did not feel entirely alone beneath the weight of memory. The storm rolled in without warning, crawling across the horizon like a wall of ash. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of tarnished iron, and the air grew heavy with the scent of rain that had been absent for months. Elias, out tending to his horse, felt the first gust strike him like a slap, hot and dry, before shifting into a sudden cool wind that carried grit into his eyes. He looked to the ridges and saw the black curtain sweeping toward the valley. He led the horse quickly back toward the trading post. By the time he reached the lean-to, the storm was nearly upon him. Dust rose in choking spirals, the world reduced to shifting shades of brown and gray. Lightning split the sky, jagged and merciless, followed by thunder so deep it shook the ground like cannon fire. Elias flinched at the sound, his body remembering the battlefield even when his mind wished to forget. Nahava's door opened just as the rain began to fall in heavy sheets. He ducked inside, shutting it against the sudden lash of water. The adobe walls groaned with the force of the wind, and droplets forced their way through cracks in the roof. Inside, the air was dim, smelling of smoke, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of cornmeal. Ahyoka was there, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She did not meet his eyes. Instead, she moved with brisk efficiency, setting out bowls to catch the drips, pouring water into a clay jug, and mending a torn sleeve with needle and thread as though the storm outside had no claim on her. Her silence weighed heavier than the thunder, yet Elias felt its edge soften. She did not flee the room. She did not hide. She simply carried out her work as though his presence was one more inevitability, like the rain itself. He sat near the fire, rifle within arm's reach, listening to the storm batter the roof. The children, Nahava's younger kin, huddled close, wide-eyed at the fury outside. Elias offered them a half-smile, the first he had allowed himself in weeks, and spoke softly to calm them. His voice, rough though it was, carried the steadiness of experience. Then came a sound beneath the storm, the distant pounding of hooves. Elias stiffened, hand moving instinctively to his rifle. He crossed to the narrow window, wiping condensation with his sleeve. In the fractured light of the storm, he caught sight of riders moving across the ridge, dark figures blurred by rain, circling like wolves. Raiders. He turned back to Nahava and Ahyoka. "There are men on the ridge," he said, his voice low but clear. Neither woman showed surprise. Nahava stood with quiet dignity, nodding once. Ahyoka's hand stilled only for a moment before resuming their work, though her eyes flicked to the door. Elias knew then that this was not the first time such riders had shadowed the settlement. Without a word, he lifted the rifle, checking the chamber. He was no conqueror anymore, no soldier seeking glory, only a weary guardian standing where he was needed. He barred the door with a heavy beam, then moved to secure the shutters. Ahyoka rose beside him, her movements quick, tying leather thongs around the window frames, reinforcing the gaps with cloth to keep the wind from tearing them loose. Their hands brushed once as they pressed the shutter closed. Neither spoke, but in that fleeting touch Elias felt something shift, a silent recognition that they stood not as strangers divided by blood or history, but as two souls joined in the same peril. The storm raged on. Thunder rolled over the valley, shaking the walls. The children whimpered, clinging to Nahava's skates. Elias crouched beside them, his rifle laid across his knees, and spoke gently of how storms were only the earth's way of cleansing itself. His words carried no poetry, only truth, but they seemed to ease the children's fear. Ahyoka watched from across the room, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes softened at the sight. Time stretched. The hoofbeats faded into the roar of rain. No attack came. Perhaps the raiders had chosen another target, or perhaps the storm itself had scattered them. Slowly, the thunder receded, and the downpour gentled into a steady rhythm like a drumbeat against the earth. When Elias unbarred the door at last, the air that swept in was cool and clean, washed of dust. Moonlight broke through the clouds, silvering the wet ground, glistening on every leaf and stone. The storm had left the world shining, fragile, as though reborn. He stepped outside, scanning the ridges, but saw no riders, only silence, broken by the drip of water from the eaves. He lowered the rifle and breathed deeply, letting the damp air fill his lungs. For the first time in many years, the smell of rain did not bring only memories of war. It brought a strange, quiet hope. Behind him, the door opened. Ahyoka stood framed in the lamplight, her braid damp from the storm. She regarded him for a long moment, her eyes no longer hard, but steady, measuring. She said nothing, yet in her gaze he saw the faintest acknowledgement, not gratitude, not acceptance, but recognition. It was enough. When she turned back inside, Elias followed, setting his rifle down by the hearth. He lowered himself to the floorboards, back against the wall, exhaustion settling over him. Yet within that exhaustion was something new, a sense that survival was not merely a matter of rifles and storms. It was trust, fragile and reluctant, born in silence yet stronger than words. As the moonlight streamed through the cracks and the fire burned low, Elias allowed his eyes to close, carrying that realization with him into the restless sleep of men who have at last found a place where they might remain. The storm had passed, but Elias did not leave. Something in him resisted the road, though he could not have said why. Perhaps it was a weariness in his bones, or the way Nahava's quiet acceptance asked nothing of him. Perhaps it was a daughter's steady presence, a silence that had ceased to feel hostile and instead lingered like an unanswered question. He rose each morning with the sun and set himself to work. The roof of the post leaked in half a dozen places, so he patched it with clay and timber, his scarred hands moving with the precision of habit. He split wood in the yard, the rhythmic crack of the axe echoing through the settlement. He repaired door hinges, reset a loose fence, oiled the squealing wheel of a wagon until it turned smooth again. These tasks carried no glory, but Elias found in them a strange peace. After years of destruction, it was no small thing to mend what was broken. Each nail driven, each board steadied, felt like a kind of prayer offered not to heaven, but to the earth that still bore him. Yet his presence unsettled others. Men of the settlement gathered in small knots, muttering when he passed. He caught fragments of their words. Outsider. Apache wives. Don't belong here. Their suspicion clung like bows, a warning he could not ignore. Elias had lived long enough to know that prejudice often struck sharper than steel. Still, he stayed. He had nowhere else to go, and something in him refused to flee from whispers. Ahyoka kept her distance. She moved through the days with quiet purpose, drawing water, tending the animals, grinding maize. She did not speak to him, yet he often felt her eyes upon him from a window or glimpsed a shadow in the doorway. It was not hostility, nor was it welcome. It was a watchfulness, as though she weighed his every act against some measure only she knew. One afternoon, as the heat pressed heavy on the settlement, Elias stepped into the back room and found her seated at the old loom. The frame sagged, its threads frayed and broken. Ahyoka's hands worked at it, attempting to restring the lines, but the wood resisted, the cord slipping loose. Her brow furrowed in frustration, and at last she let the shuttle fall into her lap. Elias hesitated in the doorway. She had not asked for help, yet something drew him forward. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, his presence filling the small space. Without a word, he reached for the loom, his hands moving with the steady care of a man who had once cleaned rifles in the dark by feel alone. He tightened a knot, tested its pull, then passed the cord across for her to anchor. She accepted silently, her fingers brushing his as she secured it. They worked in that quiet rhythm, side by side. The loom groaned as it took shape again, thread by thread stretched taut, frame by frame steadied. Their shoulders touched once, lightly, before drawing apart. Her hand grazed his as she passed the shuttle. Neither spoke. The silence between them deepened, not hostile now, but dangerous in another way, filled with an unspoken current neither dared acknowledge. At last the loom stood ready, its frame whole, its threads aligned. Ahyoka stepped back, her dark eyes resting on the work. A faint line of color touched her cheek, whether from the heat or from something else Elias could not tell. She gave the smallest nod, then turned away to fetch yarn, her braids swaying as she moved. Elias remained seated, his hands resting on his knees. His chest ached with sensation he had not felt in years, a quiet yearning, tender and restrained, as though some locked door within him had cracked open. He had thought such feelings long buried with Clara, yet here they stirred again, fragile and perilous. Later, as he stepped outside to the cool of evening, the mutter of the settlement reached his ears once more. Two men leaned against the rail, their voices low but carrying. "Don't belong here. Mark my words, nothing good comes of it." Elias met their eyes, and the men looked quickly away. He did not answer, though anger coiled in his gut. He had fought men with rifles, endured cannon fire and loss. Yet this quiet hostility was of another kind. To remain here, to stand beside Nahava and her daughter, would demand more courage than any battlefield had ever required. That night, lying on his cot, he stared at the rafters above. He thought of Ahyoka's hand steady on the loom, of the brush of her fingers against his own, of the unspoken weight in her eyes. He thought of the whispers of the townsfolk, their suspicions sharp as knives. Healing, he realized, was not a gift freely given. It was something earned, thread by thread, in the face of doubt and prejudice. If there was any chance of binding his broken life to another's, it would require patience, dignity, and will strong enough to withstand the judgment of others. He closed his eyes and let the thoughts settle in him, as the night wind pressed soft against the adobe walls. For the first time in many years, his heart carried not only memory, but the faint stirrings of something yet to come. The settlement's night carried a brittle quiet, the kind that came after a long day's toil. Lanterns glowed faintly in windows, and smoke drifted from cook fires, fading into the star-strewn dark. Elias sat on the porch of the trading post, the rough boards beneath him cool from the evening air. He smoked a hand-rolled cigarette and listened to the low murmur of voices carrying from the saloon down the road. The laughter grew louder as the hours passed. Men had been drinking heavy. He could tell by the sharp edge in their tones, the way sound traveled like knives against the night. He thought little of it at first. Drunkenness was common enough, and he had no wish to shoulder another man's temper. But then he heard a sharper note, a mocking voice, followed by a brittle silence. Elias rose and moved toward the noise. In the glow of the saloon fire, 3 men had cornered Ahyoka by the water trough. Their faces were red with drink, their words dripping with scorn. "Look at her," one slurred. "Widow woman, thinking she's too proud to take a man again." Another spat in the dust. "Half-breed bride that no one wanted. Why hide behind your mother's skirts, eh?" Ahyoka stood tall, her braid gleaming in the firelight, her face carved from stone. Yet her hands clenched the shawl at her shoulders, and Elias saw the tension in her body, the quiet fury held down only by necessity. Before the third man could step closer, Elias was there. He placed himself between them, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. His voice carried no bravado, only a steady weight. "Step aside." The men laughed. "And who are you, stranger?" "Her savior." Elias did not answer. He simply set his rifles but against the ground, his scarred hand resting on the barrel. His other fist curled at his side, the knuckles whitened from battles past. The air tightened around them, the crackle of fire louder than the men's jeers. One lunged forward, reaching for Ahyoka's arm. Elias struck, his fist colliding with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling into the date. The second reached for a knife, but Elias's rifle barrel came up swift, pressing into the man's chest. The third faltered, his drunken courage faltering beneath the cold steel of Elias's gaze. "Go home," Elias said. The words were low, but they carried finality. The men cursed, muttered threats, but they staggered away into the night, their footsteps fading down the road. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of the fire. Elias lowered a rifle and turned to Ahyoka. She had not moved, though her eyes burned with a fire sharper than any flame. For a long moment they stood in the glow of the embers, neither speaking. Then, at last, she broke the silence. "Why?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with anger so raw it seemed to cut the night. "Why do you fight for me? Do you not know what this will cost you?" Elias searched her face, seeing not weakness but strength bound tight, a strength worn thin by years of carrying scorn in silence. He felt the words rise in him, heavy with truth. "I am tired," he said. "Tired of running from ghosts, tired of watching wrongs pass me by. I have nothing left to lose that the world has not already taken." Ahyoka's eyes shone in the firelight, her breath unsteady. "And I am tired of being invisible," she whispered. "Tired of standing silent while men spit on my name, as though my life ended with his." Her hand pressed against her chest. "I am still here. I still breathe. Yet they look through me as if I were already gone." The fire snapped, sparks leaping into the dark. The night seemed to listen, the stars themselves leaning close. Between them hung no pretense, no mask, only raw honesty, bared like wounds long hidden. Elias felt something shift in his chest, a weight loosening. He had thought himself bound forever to the shadows of memory, yet in her words he heard an echo of his own silence, his own grief. And in that echo lay a bridge, fragile but real. They stood close now, close enough that the warmth of the fire mingled with the warmth of their bodies. Neither reached for the other, yet the air between them burned as if touched by flame. Ahyoka's gaze held his, unwavering. For the first time since he had known her, he saw no disdain, no guarded distance, only recognition of his scars, of his weariness, of the way their lives mirrored each other in broken lines. Elias spoke softly, almost to himself. "We are not gone yet." Her lips parted as though to answer, then closed again. She lowered her eyes, and a single tear traced the curve of her cheek. Yet her voice, when it came, was steady. "No, we are not." The fire cracked once more, as though sealing the truth between them. No vows were spoken, no promises exchanged, but something had shifted. Two lives, both scarred and silent, had begun to eat together, not by force but by recognition. Elias felt it like the first breath after drowning, the knowledge that he no longer stood alone. Ahyoka, too, seemed to stand taller, as though the weight of invisibility had eased by the smallest degree. The night around them was still, the danger gone. Yet within the silence burned a new fire, fragile, unspoken, and alive. The morning broke red across the desert sky, a sharp light spilling over mesas and dry gullies. Elias Mercer rose before the rest, the ache of restless sleep still in his bones. He saddled his horse in silence, his scarred hand steady though his heart carried a weight he could not shake. The settlement stirred uneasily. Word had come that raiders were circling again, drawn by the storm's recent chaos and the weakness they thought they smelled in the air. By noon, the air itself seemed to quiver with tension. Men gathered with rifles and shotguns, their mouths set in grim lines. The settlement's women drew the children indoors, shutters drawn, while smoke drifted faint from cooking fires quickly snuffed. Nahava stood outside her trading post, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes watchful. Beside her, Ahyoka moved among the households, steadying frightened hands, offering water, tying bandages in readiness. She did not flinch from the danger, but there was no mistaking the flicker in her eyes when they found Elias among the riders. He mounted, rifle across his lap, and joined the line of men. None welcomed him, but none pushed him away either. In times such as this, every steady shot was counted as kin. The riders set out, hooves drumming against the hard-pan earth. The desert stretched vast and silent, the sun searing overhead, as if the land itself held its breath. The raiders came swift from the north, painted faces and rifles glinting. A thunder of gunfire split the stillness, echoing off the stones. Elias dismounted and dropped to one knee, his rifle braced against the earth, firing slow and true. Each shot carried not just survival, but a grim kind of penance. Dust choked the air, men shouted, and the chaos of battle threatened to unmake the fragile line of defenders. A bullet found him then, a hot tearing pain across his arm. He staggered, nearly dropping his weapon. Blood soaked his sleeve, dark against the worn fabric. The world narrowed, sound dimming to the hammer of his own heartbeat. He thought, in that moment, of the wife buried years past, of the son he had not seen in decades, of all the lonely roads that had brought him here. Perhaps this was where it ended, on foreign soil, unnamed, forgotten. But then she was there, Ahyoka. She had run into the fray without hesitation, shawl trailing like a banner in the wind. Her hand pressed firm against his wound, her eyes fierce with something that was neither fear nor pity. She tore the fabric from her shoulders, binding his arm with quick, sure movements. Her touch steadied him, not as a savior but as one who refused to let him vanish into silence. "Stand," she whispered, voice steady even as the battle raged. "You are not finished yet." And so he did. With her shawl tied tight around his arm, Elias lifted his rifle once more. Side by side with the settlement's men, he fired until the raiders broke, scattering back into the desert like shadows fleeing the sun. When at last the dust settled, the silence that followed was vast and heavy. Bodies lay where they had fallen, the wounded groaned, and the living gathered to count themselves. Ahyoka moved among them, tending with gentle precision, her braid loose now, strands catching the light. Elias stood apart for a moment, his body trembling with exhaustion, yet his heart steadier than it had been in years. Nahava watched from her doorway, her silver-streaked braids swaying in the wind. Her eyes found Elias and Ahyoka, lingering not with surprise but with a quiet satisfaction of one whose words had always carried the weight of foresight. She said nothing, but the faint lift at the corner of her mouth was triumph enough. In the days that followed, the gossip of the town shifted. Where once there had been whispers of scorn and suspicion, there was now a quieter murmur of respect, of gratitude, of grudging acknowledgment. Survival had forged something stronger than prejudice, and dignity had bought a fragile peace. Elias knew his time in the settlement was near its end. He had never meant to linger, never meant to root himself again in any soil. Yet as he packed his throw bag, he felt a reluctance in every movement. Loneliness had been his companion so long he had mistaken it for fate. Now, he was not so certain. He stepped into the evening light, the desert wind cool against his face. His horse waited, reins hanging loose, the horizon stretched wide and unending before him. He placed his foot in the stirrup, ready to ride into solitude once more. But Ahyoka was there. She stood in the open, her braid unbound, hair flowing free in the wind. Her shawl was gone, left behind in the blood and dust of battle, yet her eyes were clear as water after rain. She did not speak, nor did she need to. In her gaze was a choice, unforced and unspoken. Elias paused, his breath caught. No promises, no vows, no illusions. Only the truth of two lives scarred yet unbroken, two hearts that had endured silence and grief yet still beat steady. He swung into the saddle, then held out his hand. Ahyoka stepped forward, sure and unhesitating, and placed a hand in his. Together they mounted, the rhythm of the horses' hooves carrying them away from the settlement, not as saviors, not as strangers, but as two souls who had chosen to see one another fully, to bind wounds with shawls and silence, to claim a second chance in a land where little was ever given freely. The desert stretched before them, vast and uncertain, yet for the first time in many years Elias felt the weight of loneliness lift. And as the horizon opened wide, he knew this was not the end of his road, but the beginning of something worth the dust, the silence, and the scars.